Here is all the updates that you need to know for F1 Fantasy after FP2. Now let's get straight into it. Now, constructor-wise, Ferrari and McLaren are a must. Now, I was tussling with the idea where if you had not enough money to bring in the best premium drivers, then you could potentially bring in Mercedes instead of McLaren. I don't think that's the case, as what we've seen from FP2, McLaren and Ferrari easily look like the top fastest cars, with everyone else struggling behind them. Then also with the constructors, Red Bull you cannot go near. Verstappen doesn't look incredibly fast around here right now, just with how the car's working. Plus Perez is Perez, so he's probably not even going to get out of the first part of qualifying. And then also, as per usual, all the cheap constructors are not worth it, as they just don't get you enough points. Now, driver-wise, premium drivers is actually, I think, one of the easiest weekends to predict as of now, because first of all, Charles Leclerc has a 10-place grid penalty, which means most people, including me, will be putting him in our teams with the 2 times, because potentially with Ferrari's pace, he'll be starting 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, overtake points, potentially driver of the day, position gain points, and the points from qualifying, because you still get the qualifying points even if you get that 10-place grid penalty. It's just a recipe for such great points. You've got to be a little bit worried because he's a little bit in the midfield, so there could be issues with crashing into another car. Plus, Abu Dhabi's not the easiest to overtake around, but with Ferrari's pace, I feel like it's just a no-brainer. You have to have Leclerc in your team. Closely followed by Lando Norris. He's been rapid this weekend, and I really do think that McLaren is closer from the looks of things from FP1 and FP2 to Ferrari than they're giving off. And Lando Norris tends to do pretty decent in qualifying. Carlos Sainz cannot be above him, even though he is cheaper. If you have the money, you have to bring in Lando Norris. So Norris and Leclerc are my 2 best premium drivers you could use. If you have a free premium driver build, you'd go for Piastri. Now, premium drivers to steer clear of still have to be both Red Bulls. So Max Verstappen, too expensive, doesn't look like he's going to be on the podium this weekend. Sergio Perez, because he's Sergio Perez. Fernando Alonso shouldn't even be on this list, but technically he's a premium driver. Lewis Hamilton, as again, he just doesn't look fast in that Mercedes right now, and if they aren't fast on race pace, he's not there, which last weekend in Qatar, we saw exactly what happens when that is the case. And even though after FP2, McLaren looked like the dominant force, Ferrari are predicted still to be the best constructor. So I do just think you only go for Oscar Piastri if you're going triple McLaren, but I do think it's one of those situations where you get one of each asset, and with Leclerc's 10-place grid penalty, you go Leclerc and Norris above all else, and then potentially, if you don't have enough money for that, you go Leclerc, Piastri, Leclerc, Sainz. And then the differential choice this weekend still is George Russell, but like I mentioned, I don't think it's as strong as it was before seeing these practice sessions. Mercedes just don't really look like they're in the fight for it this weekend, so if he did qualify well, I do believe he'd get overtaken by the McLarens, the Ferraris. Potentially not Verstappen, but still not good enough. Then cheap driver-wise, the team to beat seems like it's Haas. I don't know where this pace has come from, but Hülkenberg and Magnussen are flying. So if you can afford them with Norris and Leclerc, especially Hülkenberg, is 100% a must. And with Kevin Magnussen potentially being able to get driver of the day, final race of his career potentially, similar to the Bottas situation, I think both of them are must-haves if you can afford it. I still wouldn't recommend dropping a Norris or a Leclerc down to a Piastri or Sainz just to bring them in, but definitely worth looking at. Then you have the Williams. The issues are with their car just not being able to finish a race. They seem to always be crashing out or having issues with the car, which makes them a massive liability. So it very much is a risk it for a chocolate biscuit final race of the season move if you do go for Alex Albon, because he does look okay this weekend, especially with the 5-place grid penalty. And Colapinto, actually, funnily enough, still is a must, even with all of these issues, because he also has a 5-place grid penalty, and also just because he's so cheap, as he's still in the 7 millions. But going back to Albon for a second, realistically, if you can still afford Zhou with Norris and Leclerc, you stay with that. And if you can't afford Zhou, then that's when you start looking at potentially Alex Albon for that differential to bring up the better premium drivers. Albon has been having issues in FP2 as well, so it really is a very risky move. But especially if you have a target set for this end of the season and potentially need to go for a differential, Albon's very risky, but I could see him scoring quite a few points if he finishes the race with that 5-place grid penalty. Then you have Valtteri Bottas, who still looks like a great asset because on pace, he actually looks pretty decent. And if he does well on his final race of his career, potentially, he doesn't have a seat for 2025, then he'll potentially win Driver of the Day, which is a huge 10 plus points to have, especially from a cheap driver. So the list for the best cheap drivers is as followed. You've got K-Mag, Bottas, Colapinto, Nico Hulkenberg, and Tsunoda's, which are all, if you can afford, bring them into your teams. Then you have the still good to have, the medium level ground of Alex Albon, Zhou Guanyu, and Liam Lawson. If you can afford them, it's potentially worth looking at getting them in. And then there's the steer clears of Lance Stroll, Doohan, and Gasly, purely because Alpine, like I mentioned before, Doohan doesn't look too fast at the minute, and Gasly tends to do better in qualifying and then drop down in the races, which isn't good for F1 Fantasy. And then finally, chips wise, it's still very much simple. Just use whatever chip you have left and then follow the power rules of extra DRS, limitless, no negative, autopilot, final fix, wildcard. If you've got 2 left, just use the more powerful one. But anyway, thank you all so much for watching. This has been your F1 Fantasy post FP2 update. I will be live streaming tomorrow, an hour and 15 minutes before qualifying. Get involved. Remember the F1 Fantasy survey as well. Please fill it out so we can get some good data to show F1, to show what we want to improve with the game. But anyway, thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you all later. Take care.